the Odyssey. There is something fascinating about human reasoning, particularly when humans begin bending logic selectively in order to protect conclusions they already emotionally arrived at beforehand. And one of the more recent examples of this has appeared surrounding the Odyssey, but more specifically, the defense surrounding the casting discourse. Now, before humans immediately enter defensive response mode, let us examine the logic itself rather than the emotion around it. The argument currently being presented is this: it doesn't matter who plays the character, it's mythology, it isn't real. At first glance, this sounds internally coherent to a degree, until one applies consistency to it. Because yes, Greek mythology is mythology. However, mythology does not emerge from a vacuum. It originates from cultures, civilizations, geographic regions, historical peoples. Greek mythology is tied directly to Greece, Sparta, Troy, Sicily, the Mediterranean world. These stories are inseparable from the civilizations that produced them. Humans appear to understand this instinctively, right until consistency becomes inconvenient, because now we perform the standard Salarian test for logical stability. Apply the exact argument to another culture. Observe human reaction. For example, suppose a major studio adapts Chinese mythology, a famous mythological Chinese figure, and a white European actor is cast in that role. That would be ludicrous. Everyone would be annoyed, and rightly so. But now, according to the exact argument being used for the Odyssey, this should not matter, because it's mythology, it isn't real. Correct? But humans already know the reaction that would occur. The exact same individuals defending one scenario would likely describe the other as cultural misrepresentation, appropriation, or erasure, meaning the principle itself is not being applied consistently, only selectively. And once a principle only functions selectively, it ceases to be principle. It becomes preference masquerading as logic. Now observe carefully. This does not mean mythology requires absolute historical realism. Humans already stylize mythology constantly. Armor changes, architecture changes, events become dramatized, adaptation is normal. However, there is a gaping difference between adaptation and detachment from cultural identity entirely, because mythology is one of the ways civilizations preserve cultural imagery across generations. Greek mythology looks Greek for the same reason Norse mythology looks Scandinavian, Japanese mythology looks Japanese, and Aztec mythology looks Mesoamerican. This is not controversial, it is simply cultural origin, and a denial of that tells everyone one thing: you just don't care. At least not for this, because when it comes to cultural or historical upheaval, it's perfectly reasonable to do so to any European nation because of how tolerant they are. However, do it to any other culture and there would be problems, and rightly so. See, humans already understand this intuitively in nearly every other context, which is why the "it's mythology, so nothing matters" argument collapses immediately under consistency testing. Because if nothing matters, then humans must logically accept all mythology being detached entirely from its originating peoples. But they clearly do not believe that. They only suspend the rule in situations where doing so is socially advantageous, which is not logic, it is social calibration. And this is where humans become particularly interesting as a species. Humans often arrive at emotional conclusions first, then construct moral frameworks afterwards to justify them, rather than beginning with the framework itself. A Salarian recommendation would be simple. If humans wish to argue that mythology can freely transcend cultural appearance entirely, then apply that standard universally, to all cultures without exception. Otherwise, admit the actual position honestly, that cultural identity in mythology does matter. Humans simply disagree on when they are willing to acknowledge it. Additionally, humans appear to misunderstand the purpose of music within storytelling itself. Another argument surrounding the Odyssey concerns the inclusion of contemporary music styles, specifically rap music, justified through the statement that orchestral music, as humans recognize it today, did not exist during the era in which the Odyssey takes place. At surface level, this sounds intellectually clever until examined for coherence, because the argument operates under the assumption that if historically accurate orchestral music did not exist, then any musical style becomes equally appropriate, which is absurd. By this logic, humans could insert dubstep, breakbeat, industrial electronic music, or nightclub dance tracks, and dismiss criticism by simply stating, well, orchestral music didn't exist back then either. This completely misunderstands the role music serves within narrative language. Humans do not associate orchestral scoring with Greek epics because it is historically literal. They associate it with epics because, over generations, orchestral composition evolved into a musical language designed specifically to communicate grandeur, tragedy, heroism, scale, mythology, and emotional weight. It fits the shape of the story. This is how artistic association functions. Certain aesthetics become tied to certain experiences because they complement them naturally. Humans already understand this intuitively in nearly every other circumstance. A horror film uses tension-building sound design because it fits fear. A romance film uses softer melodic structures because it fits intimacy. A war film uses percussion and rising orchestration because it fits conflict and scale. Storytelling is not randomness, it is selection, appropriate selection. And this modern tendency to argue, well, technically this didn't exist either, therefore anything is acceptable, is not sophisticated reasoning. It is the collapse of aesthetic understanding entirely. Because artistic direction is not about whether something merely can be inserted, but whether it meaningfully complements the tone, atmosphere, and identity of the work itself. It seems folks in this discussion are having a hard time admitting that certain artistic choices simply fit certain narratives better than others. It's as if logic has gone out the window and everyone is trying to find every conceivable way to make the argument that falls flat. It's as if acknowledging suitability is somehow restrictive, but limitation is often what creates coherence. Without coherence, art becomes aesthetic noise, and aesthetic noise is not innovation, it is confusion masquerading as modernity. End of observation log.